The screen is filled with the image of embers glowing in the pre-dawn gloom. Smoke, thick and acrid, hangs heavy in the air, stinging the nostrils even through the telling. A small hand, caked in soot and grime, emerges from the gray landscape of ash and charred wood. It clutches a doll, its porcelain face cracked, its dress blackened and stiff. The hand trembles, a silent testament to a terror that has no words. The camera of our mind pulls back, revealing a young girl, no more than 7 years of age, huddled amidst the smoldering ruins of what was once a homestead. Her name is Sarah. Tear tracks have cut clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. Her eyes, wide and vacant, stare at the doll, her only anchor in a world that has just burned to the ground around her. Beyond the skeletal remains of a cabin wall, a figure stands motionless, etched against the bruised dawn sky. He is Koda, a warrior of the people, his lands stretching beyond the newly carved lines of settlement. His face, framed by raven hair, is a mask of stoic sorrow. He wears the garb of his tribe, simple, practical, yet bearing the silent dignity of generations. His eyes, though, betray a flicker of an old, familiar pain, rekindled by the scene before him. He had seen fire before, seen loss that hollowed out the soul. He makes no sound, his presence like that of a ghost, a silent witness to the fresh grief scarring this land. What path had led him to this desolate place, and what silent promise was about to be forged in the ashes? The answer would change not one life, but two, forever. Sarah's family, the Millers, had arrived in the Cottonwood Bend Valley only the spring before. Thomas, her father, was a man of broad shoulders and quiet hope, his hands already calloused from the task of turning wild earth into a farm. Mary, her mother, possessed a gentle strength, her songs often drifting on the breeze as she tended their small vegetable patch or kneaded dough for the evening's bread. Their cabin, though modest, was filled with the sturdy scent of fresh-cut pine and the brighter fragrance of Mary's dreams for a peaceful life. Sarah, with her sunshine hair and boundless curiosity, had found a universe in the creek that bordered their claim. Her laughter, a bright ribbon winding through the days. They sought not riches, but a place to root themselves, a small piece of the vast frontier to call their own. Koda, too, knew this valley. It was part of the ancestral hunting grounds of his people, the place of sacred stones and whispering pines. His normal had been shattered, not by the arrival of settlers like the Millers, whom his tribe had warily decided to tolerate for now, but by the cruel hand of sickness. The previous winter, a fever had swept through their winter camp, swift and unforgiving, taking his wife, Nita, and their young son, Little Hawk. Now, Koda walked a path shadowed by that loss. He was a respected warrior, his skill with the bow and his knowledge of the land unparalleled, but a heavy silence had settled upon him. He often ventured alone, finding a bitter solace in the solitude of the mountains, his heart a hollow echo of the drumbeat of tribal life. A tension, however, had begun to simmer in the valley, an unease that prickled the air like heat before a storm. It came not from the quiet farmers like Thomas Miller, but from a rougher sort, gold prospectors. A boisterous, careless group, led by a greedy man named Finnegan, had established a makeshift camp further upriver. Their sluicing operations fouled the water, killing the fish and making the settlers downstream uneasy. Koda had watched them too, his eyes cold. Finnegan's men were disrespectful of the land, and their casual arrogance was a spark near dry tinder. This was a different kind of encroachment, one that stank of avarice and threatened the delicate balance of survival for everyone in Cottonwood Bend. The true storm, however, gathered not from Finnegan's petty greed, but from a far more malevolent force, Captain Marcus Rourke. The name was whispered in hushed tones in the more fearful settlements, a name synonymous with cold, calculated brutality. Rourke was a man whose soul had been cauterized in the crucible of some forgotten war, leaving behind only ambition and a chilling disregard for life. He led a band of ex-soldiers, men loyal to his iron will and his promise of spoils. They were not mere bandits, scrabbling for coin. They moved with a grim efficiency, striking hard and vanishing like wraiths, leaving only terror and desolation in their wake. Their arrival in Cottonwood Bend was as sudden as a flash flood. One evening, as dusk began to settle, and the millers prepared for their supper, the chilling sound of war cries, alien and terrifying, shattered the peace. It was not the call of Koda's people, but something far more savage. Rourke's raiders descended upon the outlying homesteads with merciless precision. Fire blossomed against the darkening sky. The miller's small cabin stood little chance. Thomas fought bravely, a simple farm axe, his only weapon against their cruel blades and bullets. But he was quickly overwhelmed. Mary's screams were cut short. Sarah, small and terrified, had been playing near the root cellar behind the cabin when the chaos erupted. Her mother's last, desperate cry had been for her to hide. She scrambled into the damp darkness, clutching her doll, pulling the heavy wooden door shut just as the first flames licked at the cabin walls. Through a narrow crack, she saw things no child should ever see, heard sounds that would haunt her sleep for years to come. She stayed there, trembling in the dark, long after the screams and the thud of horses' hooves faded, long after the crackle of the fire overhead died down to a mournful hiss. It was the acrid smell of smoke, still thick hours later, that had drawn Koda from his solitary vigil in the nearby hills. He moved through the pre-dawn light with the silence of a hunting cat, his senses alert. He had seen the glow from afar, a malevolent orange staining the horizon, and a cold dread had settled in his stomach. He reached the Miller homestead as the first pale light of morning touched the smoking ruins. The devastation was absolute. And then, a faint sound, a tiny whimper, almost lost beneath the sigh of the wind through the charred timbers. His eyes, missing nothing, scanned the wreckage. He saw the slightly displaced cellar door. With cautious movements, he eased it open. And there, blinking up at him from the darkness, was Sarah, her small face a mask of soot and terror, her knuckles white around the charred doll. The warrior looked down at the child, and the vast, aching emptiness within him resonated with the fresh horror in her eyes. Koda stood for a long moment, the rising sun casting his shadow over the girl. His heart, a stone in his chest since Little Hawk's passing, felt a tremor. His tribe had known betrayal from the white man, treaties broken like dry twigs, lands stolen. His first, deeply ingrained instinct was caution, distance. This child was a settler's daughter. Her people were encroaching, changing the land, even if this particular family had seemed to wish only for peace. But as he looked at Sarah, truly looked, he saw not an enemy, not a threat, but a reflection of his own unbearable grief. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, held the same haunted emptiness that stared back at him from still pools. The charred doll in her hands, it was a stark, pitiful symbol of innocence ravaged, of a childhood stolen by brutality. He remembered Nita carefully stitching a small leather pouch for Little Hawk, filling it with smooth, colorful river stones. The memory was a sharp pang, a fresh wound. He carried dried meat in a pouch at his belt. Slowly, deliberately, so as not to frighten her further, he knelt. He pulled out a strip of the jerky, held it out to her. His face remained stoic, but his eyes conveyed a sorrow that needed no words. Sarah flinched, pressing herself further into the dirt wall of the cellar. She made no move to take the offering. Koda waited, motionless. Minutes stretched, marked only by the girl's shallow, hitching breaths and the mournful creak of a half-burned timber nearby. Finally, hesitantly, her small, trembling hand reached out. Her fingers brushed his, and for an instant, a spark of something akin to understanding passed between them. 2 souls adrift in a sea of loss. He could not leave her there. To abandon her to this desolation would be to abandon a piece of his own fractured humanity. His tribe might question his actions. Some might even condemn them. But the image of little Hawk, small and helpless in his final fevered days, burned too brightly in his mind. With a quiet grunt, he rose. He gestured for Sarah to come out. She was stiff, her limbs barely obeying her. He didn't try to touch her, but waited patiently as she crawled from the cellar, blinking against the sudden light, still clutching the doll as if it were her last connection to life itself. Their journey began in silence, a warrior and a child moving through a landscape scarred by violence. Sarah stumbled often, her small legs unused to such rough travel. Koda would pause, waiting, never rushing her, his gaze sweeping their surroundings, alert for any sign of danger. He knew these lands. He knew Rourke's kind of men would not be satisfied with just a few isolated homesteads. As they traveled, their path took them along a ridge, overlooking the wider valley. From that vantage point, they saw it. More smoke plumes rising in the distance, like angry spirits ascending to the sky. Faintly, carried on the wind, came the distant, chilling crackle of gunfire. Rourke's men were still out there, a wave of destruction rolling across Cottonwood Bend. Koda's jaw tightened. He knelt, examining tracks they crossed. Shod horses, many of them, moving with a purpose that spoke of disciplined riders, not just random marauders. He noted the depth of the impressions, the way the earth was churned. These were not the clumsy signs of Finnegan's prospectors. These were the marks of experienced men, heavily armed, moving with confidence. He said nothing to Sarah, but a new urgency entered his stride. The child, though still mostly silent, began to watch him, her fear slowly being overlaid by a dawning, desperate reliance. He was her only shield against the horrors that lurked in the shadows of this new, terrifying world. Their destination was Stone Creek, the nearest established settlement, a small cluster of buildings nestled by a bend in the river, some 2 days' hard travel away. Koda chose a difficult path, keeping to the high ground and dense thickets, avoiding the main trails where they might encounter Rourke's patrols. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the nights were cold. Sarah, despite her terror, showed a resilience that surprised Koda. She ate the dried meat he provided without complaint, drank sparingly from the skins he refilled at hidden springs. He began to point out things to her, simple survival signs, which berries were safe, how to read the direction of the wind from the trees, the distant call of a hawk that signaled clear skies. He did it not with words, but with gestures, with a look. And she watched, her young mind absorbing, a flicker of something other than fear starting to appear in her eyes. A fragile, unspoken understanding began to grow between them, forged in shared hardship and the silent language of survival. One afternoon, as they cautiously made their way through a narrow, wooded ravine, Koda suddenly froze. He put a hand out, stopping Sarah, his head cocked, listening. Then he heard it. The jingle of harnesses, the low murmur of gruff voices, the thud of hooves. A patrol of Rourke's men, at least 5 of them, was approaching along the game trail below. Koda moved with swift, silent urgency, pulling Sarah behind a dense cluster of boulders and thorny brush. He pressed her down, his hand briefly on her shoulder, a silent command to stay still and silent. The raiders passed mere yards away. Their laughter was coarse, their talk filled with boasts of plunder and cruelty. One of them, a burly man with a jagged scar across his cheek, casually struck his horse with the butt of his rifle. Sarah trembled violently, but she made no sound, her face buried against Koda's leg, the charred doll pressed between them. Koda remained perfectly still, his body a shield, his eyes narrowed, watching the men until they disappeared around a bend. The air in the ravine seemed to crackle with the near presence of death. When they were gone, he waited several long minutes before rising, his expression unreadable. Later that day, driven by a need to understand the full extent of the threat, Koda left Sarah hidden in a well-concealed alcove high on a rocky outcrop. He told her, with a combination of signs and a few guttural words in his own tongue which she somehow seemed to grasp, to stay put, to make no noise. Then, he melted into the landscape like a shadow. For hours, Sarah waited, a tiny, lonely figure, the silence of the wilderness pressing in on her. When Koda returned, his face was grim. He had found Rourke's main encampment. It was not the scattered bivouac of common outlaws, but a well-organized, almost military-style camp set in a defensible box canyon. He had crept close enough to overhear snatches of conversation. Rourke himself, a tall, imposing figure with eyes like chips of ice, was addressing his men. Koda heard the name of the town, Stone Creek. Rourke spoke of a significant payroll shipment due for the morning Sunday mine, routed through the town, and valuable supplies recently delivered to the general store. He spoke with chilling confidence, dismissing Stone Creek as a soft target, its inhabitants mere farmers and shopkeepers ripe for the taking. He planned to strike within 2 days. Koda knew then that this was more than just a series of raids. It was a calculated assault. The knowledge settled heavily on Koda. Stone Creek was a settler town. His own tribe, the Whispering Pines people, were already diminished, wary of any conflict that could bring the full might of the Bluecoats down upon them. To involve his warriors in defending a white settlement against other white men was a risk few would endorse, especially when Rourke's force was so clearly disciplined and well-armed. Yet, the image of Sarah, her innocent life shattered, and the chilling certainty of Rourke's brutality spurred him. He could not stand by and let Stone Creek suffer the same fate as the Miller homestead. He had to warn them. The final leg of their journey to Stone Creek was a desperate race against time. Koda pushed them hard, his usual measured pace now urgent. Sarah, sensing the shift in him, did her best to keep up, her small legs aching, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When they finally crested the low bluff overlooking Stone Creek, it looked deceptively peaceful, a collection of sturdy wooden buildings, a plume of smoke rising from the blacksmith shop, the lazy turn of a water wheel by the river. But as they descended into the town's main street, their appearance sent ripples of alarm through the populace. A native warrior, grim-faced and trail-worn, accompanied by a child who looked as if she had walked through the fires of hell itself. It was a sight to stop hearts and conversations. Doors creaked shut. Faces peered suspiciously from behind grubby window panes. A tall, lean man with a weary face and a star pinned to his vest stepped out from the building marked Marshall. This was Elias Wade, a man who had seen his share of trouble, but nothing quite like the pair now standing before him. "What business do you have here, warrior?" Wade asked, his voice low and cautious, his hand resting near the Colt peacemaker at his hip. Koda met his gaze squarely. "Danger comes," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. "Firemen. They ride. Many. Strong." He gestured back the way they had come. "They burn. They kill." Murmurs rippled through the small crowd of townsfolk that had begun to gather at a safe distance. Fear mingled with suspicion in their eyes. Then, a portly man in a fine but slightly dusty suit pushed his way forward. Alistair Finch, owner of Finch's Mercantile, the best-stocked store in Stone Creek. "Nonsense, Marshall," Finch declared, his voice a little too loud, a little too dismissive. "Likely just some drifters spooking this fellow. Or perhaps," he added, his eyes narrowing at Koda, "he's a scout for a larger war party, trying to frighten us into lowering our guard." Sarah, who had been hiding behind Koda, her face buried in his buckskin leggings, whimpered. She clutched her charred doll tighter. Marshall Wade looked from Koda's impassive face to the terrified child. then to Finch's blustering countenance. He was a man who trusted his gut, and something about Finch's overly eager denial felt wrong. "What? Firemen?" Wade asked Koda, his gaze returning to the warrior. Before Koda could elaborate, Sarah herself, in a voice barely above a whisper, choked out, "Fire! The firemen! Mama! Papa!" She held up the doll, its blackened face a mute accusation. The sight of the child, her raw grief so palpable, sent a shiver through some of the onlookers. A woman in the crowd gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Koda's eyes, however, had not left Alistair Finch. He'd seen men like Finch before, men whose greed made them blind, or worse, treacherous. He noted the way Finch avoided, looking directly at Sarah, the slight tremor in his fleshy hands. As he repeatedly adjusted his waistcoat, he saw the almost imperceptible glance Finch shot towards the rear of his own store, a glance that held a flicker of something. Calculation? Fear? It was a detail others might miss. But to Koda, whose life had often depended on noticing the smallest flicker in the brush, the slightest change in the wind, it was a discordant note in the man's performance. The merchant protested too much, his defense of the town's safety sounding more like a defense of his own inventory. A cold suspicion began to form in Koda's mind. Marshal Wade, though still wary, was a fair man. The child's testimony, broken as it was, and the stark evidence of the doll, weighed heavily on him. He'd also heard whispers of Rourke, faint at first, but growing. "All right," Wade said slowly, his eyes on Koda. "Tell me everything." Koda recounted what he had seen, his words sparse but impactful. The size of Rourke's force, their disciplined nature, the attack on the homesteads, and the overheard plans to strike Stone Creek, specifically mentioning the payroll and supplies. As he spoke, Finch scoffed and interrupted, trying to discredit Koda. But Wade silenced him with a sharp look. Some of the townsfolk, men who had built their homes with their own hands, began to listen more intently. A few nodded grimly. They recalled past dealings with Koda's tribe, moments of quiet trade or shared information about treacherous game trails. These men knew Koda's people were not prone to idle talk or baseless fear-mongering. "We ain't got much time if what you say is true," Marshal Wade finally conceded, rubbing his jaw. "Rourke. I've heard the name. Never thought he'd venture this far." He made his decision. "All right, folks, listen up. We prepare for a fight." A wave of unease, but also a grim determination, spread through the small crowd. Barricades were hastily improvised from wagons, barrels, and timber. Ammunition was counted, rifles checked. Koda, despite the lingering suspicion in some eyes, found himself advising the marshal. He pointed out the most likely avenues of attack, the blind spots in the hastily constructed defenses, the importance of conserving ammunition until the raiders were close. He moved with a quiet authority that began to earn grudging respect. Alistair Finch continued to grumble, complaining about the disruption to business. But even he was swept up in the urgent preparations, albeit reluctantly. Dawn broke cold and gray, the sky mirroring the tension that gripped Stone Creek. Every able-bodied man, and even a few determined women, stood ready, armed with whatever they could find. Sarah was kept safe in the back of the blacksmith's shop, under the watchful eye of Martha, the blacksmith's kind but sturdy wife. Koda positioned himself on the roof of the livery stable, affording him a clear view of the main approach to the town. He was a still, silent figure, bow in hand, a quiver of arrows at his side. He was not just fighting for Stone Creek. He was fighting for the memory of his own lost family, for the small, traumatized girl who had somehow found a crack in the armor around his grieving heart. The attack came with the suddenness of a thunderclap. Rourke's men, confident and battle-hardened, charged into Stone Creek, expecting little resistance. They were met with a surprisingly coordinated volley of fire. The fight was desperate, brutal, Dust and gun smoke filled the air, the shouts of men and the screams of horses creating a hellish cacophony. Rourke, mounted on a powerful black charger, directed his men with cold precision, his voice cutting through the din. During a brief lull in the fighting, as Rourke's men regrouped for another assault, Koda's sharp eyes caught movement at the rear of Finch's mercantile. He saw Finch slip out the back door, carrying what looked like a lantern, and move towards a small, seemingly disused shed behind the main building. Koda had noted earlier that this shed offered a clear line of sight to the bluffs where Rourke's main force had likely waited for the signal to attack. A terrible suspicion solidified into certainty. Finch was not just a doubter. He was a traitor. Koda nimbly dropped from the rooftop, moving through the chaos of the battle with ghost-like speed. He reached Marshal Wade, who was reloading his rifle behind an overturned wagon. "Finch!" Koda hissed, pointing. "He signals them! From the shed!" Wade's eyes widened, then narrowed with fury. He had trusted Finch, a leading citizen. The betrayal cut deep. "Cover me!" he yelled to the men nearby, and then, with Koda at his heels, they raced towards the mercantile. They burst into the shed just as Finch was about to wave the lit lantern. He had also gathered a hidden cache of rifles and ammunition boxes, clearly intended for Rourke, not the town's defense. Caught red-handed, Finch's bluster evaporated, replaced by a sniveling terror. It wasn't supposed to be like this," he stammered. "Rourke promised no one would get seriously hurt. Just a bit of plunder." Wade, his face like granite, disarmed Finch and bound his hands. "You sold us out, Finch, for coin." The revelation of the merchant's treachery, quickly spreading through the defenders, galvanized them with a fresh wave of outrage and determination. The final assault by Rourke's men was met with a renewed ferocity. Knowing they had been betrayed from within only hardened the resolve of Stone Creek's defenders. Koda, his bow singing, picked off raiders with deadly accuracy, his arrows finding their mark with lethal precision. He saw Rourke rallying his dwindling forces near the town square, his face contorted with rage at the unexpected resistance. This was the moment. Koda moved from cover to cover, closing the distance. He confronted Rourke amidst the chaos, a warrior driven by ancient grief and a new, fierce protectiveness against a captain whose only god was power. Their fight was short but savage. Rourke, overconfident and furious, lunged with his saber. Koda, agile and deadly, sidestepped the clumsy attack, his own knife flashing. It was over quickly. Captain Marcus Rourke fell into the dust of the town he had sought to destroy. His reign of terror ended. With Rourke's fall, the remaining raiders lost heart. Some threw down their weapons and surrendered. Others fled into the wilderness, pursued by the now victorious townsfolk. Stone Creek was saved, though the victory was etched with sorrow for the fallen and the scars of the battle. The sun climbed higher, illuminating a scene of grim aftermath, but also dawning relief. Alistair Finch was locked in his own storeroom, awaiting the arrival of a territorial judge. The captured raiders were disarmed and guarded. Marshal Wade, weary but resolute, surveyed his town. They had held. In the days that followed, Stone Creek began to heal. The dead were buried. The wounded tended. Sarah, quiet and watchful, found a gentle protector in Martha, the blacksmith's wife. The woman, whose own children were grown and gone, saw the ghost of immense loss in Sarah's eyes and responded with simple, unwavering kindness. Sarah still clutched her charred doll, but sometimes a fleeting, almost smile would touch her lips when Martha spoke to her softly or offered her a warm biscuit. Koda did not stay long in Stone Creek. He had done what he felt he must. He watched as the townsfolk, their initial suspicion replaced by a deep, abiding gratitude, began to piece their lives back together. He shared a silent, respectful nod with Marshal Wade, an understanding passing between two men who had faced death and survived. Before he left, he sought out Sarah. She was sitting on the steps of the blacksmith shop, Martha gently trying to braid a ribbon into her tangled hair. Koda knelt before her. He reached into the small pouch at his belt, the one that had once held Little Hawk's treasures. He pulled out a small, perfectly smooth river stone, its surface cool to the touch. He pressed it gently into Sarah's free hand, the one not clutching the doll. Their eyes met. In hers there was still fear, but also a flicker of something else, trust. He said nothing, then rose, and with a final glance at the town, turned and walked towards the wilderness, disappearing as silently as he had come. Sarah watched him go, the small stone warm in her palm. The warrior's path led back to his people, his own grief perhaps not erased, but touched by the unexpected connection to this small, resilient girl. Her path lay ahead, in a town that had shown courage, with people who offered solace. The charred doll remained a symbol of what was lost, but the smooth stone, a gift from a grieving warrior, was a token of a different kind, a promise of survival, a reminder that even in the deepest ashes, hope, however fragile, could take root. Both their lives, touched by tragedy and an unlikely bond, were forever changed on that dusty, blood-stained trail. The West was a harsh land, but sometimes it also offered the rarest of things, a second chance, born from the courage of a few and the unexpected kindness of a stranger.